You start to see the difference around 35. Not because life suddenly reveals some final scoreboard, but because patterns become harder to ignore. When you're younger, everything still feels reversible. Choices feel temporary. You tell yourself you can always pivot later, always catch up, always start over. At 22 or 26, risk and safety don't look that different yet because time smooths the edges. Everyone is still becoming. No one has fully arrived. But by the mid-30s, trajectories start to solidify. I remember reading an essay that said this shift becomes visible around 35, and it stayed with me because it matched what I'd already been sensing quietly. Not in a dramatic, judgmental way, more like a slow focusing of the lens. You begin to notice how people's lives carry the weight of their earlier decisions, not just financially, but emotionally, physically, relationally. And here's the first uncomfortable truth. Taking risks does not automatically lead to a better life. That's something people don't like to admit. We suffer from massive survivorship bias. We celebrate the founder who made it, the traveler who found themselves, the career switcher who doubled their income. We rarely hear about the ones who worked 18-hour days for 15 years waiting for a breakthrough that never came, or the ones who chased freedom and ended up exhausted, underinsured, and quietly anxious about retirement. I've met people in their 50s who took enormous risks early on, started companies at 18, lived in constant feast or famine cycles, sold businesses, started over, sold again. On paper, it sounds exciting. In reality, many of them are behind their peers in long-term security. Retirement accounts tell the story bluntly. So do their bodies. So does the grief they carry for the vacations they never took, the friendships they let fade, the years they lived inside just one more push. Risk has a cost, and sometimes that cost is invisible until much later. At the same time, I've watched people who stayed the course quietly build something solid. They worked stable jobs, they invested early and consistently, they didn't chase every opportunity. By their mid-30s, they have leverage, time, money, flexibility, energy. They don't talk much about finding themselves, but they sleep well, they're present with their families, their nervous systems aren't fried. And yet, that path isn't automatically superior either, because here's the second uncomfortable truth. Not taking risks also has a cost. Some people reach their mid-30s and realize their world never expanded. Same city, same routines, same reference points. Their life is safe, but small. Not miserable, just narrow. They've never tested themselves against the unknown, never had to rebuild after failure, never discovered what they're capable of when the plan collapses. You can feel that difference in conversations. People who took risks often speak with a different kind of confidence, not arrogance, confidence in survival. They know they can land on their feet because they've done it before. They've moved cities, lost jobs, watched businesses fail, started again. Their identity isn't fused to one role or one outcome. That doesn't mean they're happier. It means they're less afraid of uncertainty. Meanwhile, people who played it safe often have deep roots, but sometimes fragile ones. Their stability depends on systems continuing to work as expected. When disruption hits, layoffs, illness, divorce, it can feel world-ending because they've never had to adapt at that scale before. So by 35, the difference you start to see isn't winners versus losers, it's nervous systems shaped by different data. Risk takers have more proof that they can survive chaos. Non-risk takers have more proof that consistency compounds. Both are valid forms of wisdom. Both come with blind spots. Another thing that becomes clear by 35 is that risk isn't one thing. It's not just quitting your job or moving across the country or starting a business. Risk can be emotional, social, relational, physical, financial, even existential. Some people never take career risks, but take emotional ones. They choose vulnerable relationships. They have children despite fear. They confront their trauma early because that kind of risk pays dividends later in intimacy and self-trust. Others take massive financial risks but avoid emotional ones. They build impressive resumes and empty personal lives. That imbalance also shows by 35. And moderation matters more than ideology. I've seen people romanticize risk so much that they ignore sustainability. They treat exhaustion like a badge of honor. They tell themselves they're living fully while their health quietly erodes. By their mid-30s, they're successful on the outside and depleted on the inside. On the flip side, I've seen people avoid risk so thoroughly that their lives calcify. They optimize for comfort and wake up one day restless, resentful, and confused why safety doesn't feel satisfying anymore. By 35, the fantasy versions of both paths tend to collapse. What replaces them is something quieter and more personal: alignment. The people who seem most at peace aren't necessarily the biggest risk takers or the safest players. They're the ones whose choices matched their actual values and temperament. The electrician who took a pay cut to gain time with family. The corporate worker who enjoys structure and used it to build a calm, well-resourced life. The traveler who eventually settled, not because they failed, but because they were done. Fulfillment turns out to be less about boldness and more about honesty. And that's the part younger people often miss when they ask, should I take risks now? The better question is, what kind of discomfort are you willing to live with long term? The discomfort of instability, uncertainty, and rebuilding? Or the discomfort of routine, patience, and delayed gratification? Neither choice is neutral. Both shape who you become. By 35, you don't just see who took risks and who didn't, you see who paid attention to themselves and who followed a script that didn't fit. And that, more than anything, is what shows up in people's faces, their relationships, and the way they talk about their lives. By the time people reach their mid-30s, another layer becomes visible too. Regret doesn't come from failure as much as from misalignment. That surprised me when I first noticed it. Some of the people who regret the most are not the ones who failed at big risks. They're the ones who succeeded at lives they didn't actually want. They did everything right: stable job, predictable path, reasonable choices. And yet there's a quiet mourning for the versions of themselves they never allowed to exist. At the same time, some of the people who took big risks and didn't get the payoff don't necessarily regret trying. What they regret is how long they stayed stuck in a story that stopped serving them, waiting for the breakthrough, waiting for validation, waiting for it to finally be worth it. By 35, you start to see how long people stayed in certain chapters. That's where the real difference shows up. Risk takers often talk about timing differently. They learn, sometimes painfully, that knowing when to stop is as important as knowing when to leap. The ones who adapt tend to be okay. The ones who cling to identity, I'm an entrepreneur, I'm a traveler, I'm a hustler, often struggle when reality asks them to evolve. On the other side, people who stayed safe start to realize that safety doesn't automatically equal fulfillment. Some begin to experiment later: new hobbies, side projects, therapy, late career shifts. And interestingly, those late risks are often more successful because they're grounded in self-knowledge instead of desperation. This is another thing you learn with age. Early risks are often driven by identity confusion. Later risks are driven by clarity. There's also a physical component people don't talk about enough. Your body keeps score. People who took relentless risks without rest often hit a wall in their late 30s. Burnout isn't just emotional, it's neurological. Hormones shift, recovery slows. What felt exhilarating at 25 feels punishing at 35. Meanwhile, people who built steady rhythms earlier often have more physical resilience later. They can afford to take selective risks because their baseline is stable. So when people say you see the difference at 35, it's not a moral judgment, it's a systems view. You're seeing how habits, stress, sleep, money, and relationships compound. And perhaps the most humbling realization is this: no path protects you from doubt. Risk takers wonder what life would have looked like if they'd stayed. Non-risk takers wonder what life would have looked like if they'd jumped. The difference is not who wonders, it's who feels trapped by the wondering. The healthiest people I know at this age hold a strange dual awareness. They accept the costs of their choices without romanticizing the alternatives. They don't say, "I should have." They say, "This is what I chose, and this is what it gave me." That level of ownership is rare, and it doesn't come from taking risks or avoiding them. It comes from reflection. By 35, time feels different. Not scarce, but valuable. You stop spending it to prove something. You start spending it to sustain something. That's why the risk conversation changes. It becomes less about bold moves and more about intentional ones. Less about identity and more about alignment. Less about chasing intensity and more about building a life you don't need to escape from. So if you're younger and standing in that risk-heavy window, here's what I wish more people said clearly. Take risks that teach you something real about yourself. Avoid risks that are just distractions from insecurity. Don't confuse suffering with meaning. Don't confuse comfort with failure. And remember this, the difference you'll see at 35 won't be who lived louder, it will be who lived more honestly. That's what shows.